don't you first tell us who Shaun McCutcheon is? What is this Supreme Court case based on?
Shaun McCutcheon is a wealthy businessman from Alabama who, during the 2012 elections, decided that he wanted to cut a bunch of checks to right-leaning congressional candidates that he supported. You know, he actually made the checks out in the amount of $1,776, You know, he's a self-styled patriot, I suppose. What he found was that he could write, several dozen of these checks, 27 of them, but he could not write the 28th. He had bumped up against what was called the aggregate limit, this kind of overall limit that was at issue in yesterday's ruling in front of the Supreme Court, with the urging of some conservative lawyers and ultimately the help of the whole Republican Party. Shaun McCutcheon, took his case to court and said, I don't think that you should be able to stop me from writing as many $1,776 checks as I want, and knowing that with the Roberts Court the way it is, his challenge would stand a pretty good chance of succeeding. He filed a case well over a year ago and has taken it all the way to the top. And yesterday we saw that the Roberts Court agreed with him.
The statement of Shaun McCutcheon praising the decision, he said, today the United States Supreme Court took a stand in favor of our constitutional freedom of speech as codified in our First Amendment. First Amendment free speech enables us to support candidates for public office who share our views. While I understand some base limits on the dollar amount of single contributions, limits to the overall number of candidates, parties, and committees are nothing more than unnecessary limits to First Amendment freedom, he said. So can you respond to that? What exactly did this Supreme Court decision, does it mean for the 2014 midterm elections?
Well, it's empowered this very tiny slice of wealthy Americans who are fired up about politics and want to throw their money around in a whole new way. Now, before this decision yesterday, if you were a wealthy 1%er or 0.1%er and you wanted to get involved in politics, a Sheldon Adelson, a Michael Bloomberg, you had options of forming a super PAC or giving to a super PAC. These entities ushered in after Citizens United that can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money. You could also give to a nonprofit group. These are the shadowy entities that the Koch brothers like to use that also accept and spend unlimited amounts of money. Now, for the 2014 election, you can also cut checks of, $2.3 million to support a whole array of congressional candidates. You could write a check for more than $10 million to political action committees. So this decision is going to reshape, the world, but really for a tiny amount of people in this country who have that kind of means. And, now they can also, in addition to giving to super PACs, in addition to giving to nonprofit groups, they can also give money to parties and candidates and PACs. So it's another option for a very tiny slice of our population.
During oral arguments for McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Commission, Justice Antonin Scalia questioned U.S. Solicitor General Don Verrilli, who defended limits on combined campaign contributions. Scalia argued even if the limits were lifted, allowing donor to give $3.5 million to candidates and parties during a 2-year period, that amount would be small compared to the large sums spent during an election season. This is a clip of their exchange.
If you assume somebody that gives the maximum to every possible candidate and party he can contribute to throughout the United States, $3.5 million, just to put that in perspective, how much money is spent by political parties and PACs in all elections throughout the country?
No, I think
in one election cycle.
I think that's a good point, Justice Scalia. I think it
you have any idea how much?
I do. Take the 2010 elections, non-presidential year. Each party spent, and parties and candidates together on each side spent approximately $1.5 billion.
$1.5 billion. And what about PACs?
That I don't have the specific for.
But that was a lot in the last few elections.
But here's the problem.
And what about newspapers that spend a lot of money in endorsing candidates and promoting their candidacy? I suppose you have to put in that money too. That is money that is directed to political speech. When you add all that up, I don't think $3.5 million is a heck of a lot of money.
I don't
spread throughout the country.
I don't think
That's Justice Antonin Scalia questioning U.S. Solicitor General Don Verrilli. Can you explain that for us, Andy Kroll?
Yeah, the Solicitor General was giving examples of how, if the court did agree with Shaun McCutcheon, donors would be able to cut 7- and 8-figure checks to political parties and to candidates. This 3.5 million number is one that's been tossed around to candidates and parties during an election cycle. And Scalia sort of takes a very common and I think disingenuous approach among conservatives, which is to say, well, 3.5 million, compare it to how much we spend on elections. Well, that's just a drop in the bucket. Not very much money, as he said there. But obviously, to the average person, 3.5 million in terms of political speech is a huge number. And if you talk to members of Congress or people who are running for office, 3.5 million from a single donor absolutely is a lot of money. And it means a lot. And it has an effect on people running for Congress. It has an effect on those in office, thinking about legislating, thinking about the ramifications of their decisions, and knowing now that a donor has the ability to write this 7-figure check if they either maybe agree with you or don't agree with you, they think your party is good, think your party is bad. So I think as Senator John McCain, who actually supports some more campaign finance regulation, has said, he thinks the Supreme Court is just naive about how campaigns and elections and influence work here in Washington. And I would tend to think that Senator McCain is onto something there.
Talk about the unusual reading of the dissent by Justice Breyer from the bench.
Yeah, Justice Breyer he completely disagrees with the Chief Justice Roberts' opinion in McCutcheon, as well as Justice Clarence Thomas's opinion that went even further and basically said, let's just nuke campaign finance regulation entirely. Justice Breyer, really thinks that the Roberts Court takes a far too narrow definition of what is actually corruption, and thus what can we regulate and what can't we regulate. Justice Breyer believes that the Roberts Court has narrowed the definition of what corruption is, essentially a donor basically putting money in the back pocket of a lawmaker, and narrowed it to the degree to which basically no campaign finance regulation can stand anymore. And Justice Breyer has been very vocal in saying that, hey, look, politics, it doesn't just work like that. Corruption just doesn't work like that. There are bigger issues at play here. And our democracy doesn't work when you have donors basically free to write checks for $1 million or $10 million if you're talking about a super PAC. And so Breyer has been very outspoken about that. And his dissent was of quite a read yesterday. And I recommend it to anyone who wants to wrap their head around this issue.
Andy Kroll, talk about how these campaign finance regulations were put into place. Go back to Watergate.
Sure, yeah, it's a little bit of a history lesson. So before Watergate, there really was no strong regulation of how money flows into our politics. You have the Watergate scandal, which at its core was a campaign finance scandal. You have a wave of lawmakers swept into office who were pro-reform, who supported, more regulation and supported some kind of system about, for how our campaigns and elections work. You had the creation of the Federal Election Commission, for instance, in the wake of Watergate, and that law, the regulation after Watergate is challenged in court. The case is known as Buckley versus Vallejo, which some people might have heard of, and opinion in 1976. In the Buckley versus Vallejo case, the Supreme Court decision says that, yeah, it's okay. You can put limits on contributions, me, the donor, giving to you, the candidate. You can put limits like this aggregate limit, this overall limit that was at issue in McCutcheon. And the court said, there is a real interest in protecting against corruption or the appearance of corruption, the kind of corruption that we saw in the Watergate scandal and in many instances before that. And so that is sort of the bedrock of this system we have now. And what we have seen since 1976, practically, is a systematic effort by conservatives, by libertarians, to demolish that bedrock.
And Andy Kroll, we just have 30 seconds, but how this will affect the states individually?
Yeah. Well, there are a dozen states that have similar overall limits on the books, and those limits are about to be destroyed. I mean, it's just a matter of time before the Attorney General or some election administrator in those states says, well, our limit's unconstitutional too. So this decision will resonate in Congress, and it will resonate in these states.